Well, hi folks. It's Wednesday, November 6th, and it's I think it's a complicated day for a variety of reasons, and I want to talk about several of them. Uh, was not necessarily planning to have this conversation today. I know a lot of folks have pretty strong feelings about the election and what has transpired. I am going to reflect on that because I think it's an important moment to do so in the context of weather and climate and so many other things, of course, as well. It is also the case that the natural world waits for no one, and there is currently an urban interface wildfire emergency unfolding in Southern California, in Ventura County, near Camarillo, just east of Oxnard, where dozens to perhaps even hundreds of structures have burned in a fire during strong Santa Ana wind conditions. It's unclear exactly the extent of the damage from that fire right now, but just from live television footage, it's clear that the structural loss is at least in the dozens and perhaps into the hundreds. There have been some injuries. The fire is about 10 to 15,000 acres, and it's continuing to spread rapidly with 50 to 70 mile an hour winds in the area. Fortunately, there are not too many fires burning. This is really the only big one right now. There was another one earlier in Malibu that burned several homes, but that's under control. So I am going to start by doing a brief look at the fire activity in the ongoing Santa Ana wind event because there are people who are acutely affected. But then after that, I want to offer some broader, unstructured reflections about this moment and where we are and where we're headed next. So with the fire right now, as I mentioned in the last live stream, there is what is considered to be an extremely critical fire risk period right now in Southern California due to widespread, very strong Santa Ana winds with low relative humidity, extremely low relative humidity, and very dry fuels. That's characteristic of an environment where fires can spread very quickly if they ignite. A couple did. One of them has gone very large. Again, is now almost 15,000 acres. This is the Mountain Fire in Ventura County. It has hopscotched over several ridgelands and is now burning structure to structure in neighborhoods. So it's turned into another wildland urban interface wildfire disaster, at least on a local scale and perhaps on a larger scale as well. The fire has burned almost all the way up to Highway 101, which is remarkable because you do start to run out of vegetation in that area, but since it's burning through neighborhoods, that has been enough fuel for this fire to make it within a couple hundred yards of the freeway, already having jumped another couple of major roads inland. And I'm going to briefly share some imagery just to show folks where this is, and then I'm going to turn the camera back on myself in just a moment here. So you'll see my infinite mirror briefly for a moment. Here is currently a live satellite view of Southern California. You can see, generally speaking, the northerly flow. This is not smoke, actually. These are strands of high clouds. So like these here, obviously over the ocean, is not smoke. That's just an indication of where the upper level winds are coming from. But readily apparent is also this is the mountain fire and its smoke plume, which is heading out over the Pacific Ocean, over the Channel Islands here. And you can see that the winds in lower levels are actually more east to west. So the higher in elevation you go, the winds are north to south, and they veer to east to west over the lower elevations. If I switch over to the infrared satellite imagery, you'll see where the fire is, and of course it stands out quite clearly. This big black blob, that's where the mountain fire is up there in Ventura County. It started over here this morning. It has spread about this far. So again, it's a 15,000 acre fire. It's quite large. Fortunately, not seeing any other major hotspots right now in Southern California, but the particularly dangerous situation, red flag warning from the National Weather Service, will remain in effect through at least tomorrow morning and through Friday in some places. I'm going to share, they often share my YouTube live streams on air, so I'm going to presume it's okay to do so briefly. The ABC7 live stream, where they currently have some live footage of the fire, and I'm not going to leave this on for too long, but I just want to show the imagery of neighborhoods destroyed by fire, by this fast-moving fire. And so this has unfortunately been a highly destructive fire, probably at least the second most destructive fire of the season in California, if not the most destructive, depending on what the final toll is. The Park Fire, of course, burned hundreds of structures earlier this season. It remains to be seen whether it's quite on that scale, but you can see large-scale structure loss in neighborhoods on the live screen right now, so I don't think I'm going out too much on a limb to say this has been a highly destructive fire that is continuing to burn structures as it moves forward. Again, this is not necessarily even a heavily vegetated area in some cases, but it's just this became a suburban firestorm, and you can see that many of these structures are destroyed. Some of them are still actively burning, and the fire is still spreading from structure to structure, and you can see that their strong winds continue. These are still pushing these embers, and what's known as ember storms, moving from street to street, burning structure by structure, in the dozens at least. In fact, I think you can see dozens of structures either on fire or having burned just in this one live shot for the 30 seconds I've been talking here. So I won't belabor the point, but this is what it looks like. I think most folks who needed to get out have already gotten out of the area. There was a pretty frenzied evacuation earlier, but I think that there are ongoing concerns in the area. For anybody who hasn't gotten out, of course, it's important to do so. Just to show an indication of where the fires are, again, most of these fires are older fires. These are the fires that have been burning since September. They're not currently very active. This was the fire in Malibu that burned several homes along the Pacific Coast Highway this morning. And then if I zoom in, this is the mountain fire that I was talking about. Of course, this footprint is old. The fire has burned through many neighborhoods in this vicinity. I'm not being very careful with drawing tool, but the fire has made it almost all the way to 101 right here. So it has burned essentially from point of origin over here all the way to 101, and there are a lot of structures in this area. I just noticed on the map it looks like there's a new fire that's broken out since I started talking. Looks like this is down in Orange County. Let's just see, I'm on watch duty. And that might be down, okay, that looks like it's on Camp Pendleton, so that's military ground, and for better or for worse, there's not a lot of structures in the area, so it is windy. That could get bigger, and any other fires that pop up will likely get bigger as well. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to share about this fire. Unfortunately, again, I'm bringing back the live stream on the mountain fire. It looks pretty bad. There's even cars in the street on fire that you can see in this live shot. I think that's what that is, or maybe someone's garbage can, actually. But the point is, it's structure to structure. There's a lot of loss, and hopefully this gets wrapped up soon. But the winds continue, the red flag warnings continue, and I would be surprised if there weren't additional fires that broke out during this red flag event. That wide view gives you some indication of this is definitely an urban interface WUI fire, and there are lots of structures currently involved. With the vegetation just fire hopscotching through neighborhood vegetation, through parks, through people's backyards. We've seen this play out so many times. Unfortunately, it's just happening in yet a new neighborhood. So I'm going to leave that fire at that for now, because I don't have a great deal of additional information to share with folks at this point beyond what's publicly available. So I'm not sure how much more of value I can add. Fortunately, there are not numerous fires, but right now, essentially one very big one, and unfortunately, very destructive one. We'll hear more about the details later. And again, this red flag event is going to continue for at least another 24, if not another 36 or so hours, so please be careful. out there. It's worth noting that this fire has resulted in the evacuation of the National Weather Service office in Oxnard, not because I believe it was directly at risk from the fire, but more because the office was being inundated with dense smoke. So the office staff from the Weather Service at Oxnard is by all accounts safe, but has been evacuated, and I'm not sure that's happened before for a wildfire with that office that I'm aware of. So that's a significant event in its own right. So I think what I really wanted to do today was just reflect a little more broadly. And it is more than a little bit ironic that that was briefly interrupted by yet another unfolding weather-related disaster in California, where many people have lost their homes and incurred another frenzied evacuation. I think that probably only makes the stress of today worse for some folks, but it's not unrelated to the broader conversation in the sense that we don't get to pick and choose the order of operations of how the world works. The natural world is going to throw big bad things at us, whether we like it or not, and whether or not it's at a convenient time. That's the nature of those sorts of things. And I think this just illustrates the difficulty of sometimes focusing on the importance of the moment, even in moments that are very consequential. And I think, as folks know who followed me for many years, I've been producing weather and climate discussions on the Weather West blog now since about 2007. So it's that's something that has persisted from the heyday of blogging, even though we're long since past that. Unfortunately, I would say. For those of you who followed me for a long time, I try really hard to keep the politics out of it, the discussion, whenever there's reasonable means to do so, and that's for several reasons. It's not because science or weather or climate or disasters are unrelated to the political environment of the day. They absolutely are. All of those things are actually quite political, for better or for worse. That's just the way it has been and the way that it will continue to be. But I do try and focus on the other aspects because my goal really is to communicate with as diverse an audience as I can and foster conversations that are constructive, ultimately. Hopefully interesting, but more importantly, constructive, and that can bring people together. And I think the challenge with talking about the politics of it all is often that it becomes so immediately divisive in a way that really shouldn't be the case. We really should be able to have those kinds of conversations without immediately resorting to name-calling and death threats. And I've gotten several of those today already, by the way, just as an indication of how much the landscape has already shifted since yesterday. If you're a climate scientist or a weather scientist or possibly many kinds of scientists in the United States. But what I really wanted to reflect on a little bit is what it means to be the bearer of bad news frequently. Sometimes I've reflected with some physician and medical science and biomedical colleagues that sometimes as a climate scientist it feels like you're sort of the perpetual oncologist in the sense that you're only delivering the bad medical news to people. It's never, the answer is never the cancer's in remission or good news, we got clear margins. It's been a lot of not so great news on the climate front. And the good news on the climate front in recent years has largely been associated not so much with the physical climate system, but with the progress that had been made on the policy side of things, in politics, surrounding things like the infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was effectively a big piece of climate legislation that has resulted in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to what the trajectory would have been with the big explosion in renewable energy, or what would have been some other climate policy successes in recent years that did not quite come to pass, but I think resulted in some real optimism that perhaps we would avert some of the worst case scenarios for global warming, because we would not ultimately continue down that path of continued sustained very high levels or increasing levels of global carbon emissions. Of course, those heat trapping greenhouse gases that cause global warming in the first place. And and because of that, because a lot of that optimism had been attached to the policy world and the policy successes, we talk about the Paris Agreement on the global scale, talk about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. And those successes were neither guaranteed nor are they irreversible. And in this moment, I think we were already seeing that we were not meeting the Paris Agreement commitments that had been made to keep global warming under, say, 1.5 degrees centigrade. I think that was already a goal that we were probably not on track to meet regardless. But then the question was, can we still keep it below 2? And it might have been a stretch, but I think it was certainly not a technological impossibility. It was really just a question of politics. And one of the reasons I think why the outcome of the election yesterday is such a blow in this context is that I don't think it's going out very much on a limb to say that it's extraordinarily unlikely that we keep global warming under 2 degrees centigrade at this point. And really, we were still on a path, the median path, towards about 2.5 degrees of warming. And my professional internal model for how much warming the Earth will likely experience over the rest of the century, which we're, of course, a quarter of the way through, essentially, at this point. So that's not really being futuristic. It's to say the other 3/4 of the century we're currently living through went up considerably since yesterday. And I wish that I wouldn't be able to infer that so clearly from the outcome of this election. I genuinely wish that would be unwarranted and rampant speculation about what might come next, but I just don't think it is. I think that the world, not just geopolitically, which of course it's changed dramatically this week, but geophysically too, I think our plausible future trajectory is notably different than it was just a couple of days ago. And I think that's an important thing to recognize and be honest about, because as somebody who's very used to delivering bad news, I mean, think of the main reason why people join me live or read the weather blog. The readership always goes up when there's extreme weather and disasters and extreme fires. For understandable reasons. It's the same reason why today's weather is very nice, sunny, calm, and boring is not really a news story. I mean, who would read that news story? I mean, that's just the way that that things go. That's not surprising or even necessarily a bad thing. But it does mean that I've gotten quite used to engaging with folks to talk about things that are difficult from the perspective of, you know, these kinds of events that cause mass harm to people, that you know, disasters that can kill people and destroy people's homes and their livelihoods and forcibly relocate them and have traumatic evacuation or life and death type experiences. And I hear from folks all the time who have those kinds of experiences and traumas. And so you don't really become inured to it. I would actually say it's quite the opposite. But what it does mean is that people sort of get used to you being the kind of person who you're only going to hear from if the news is bad, and that does become difficult, you know, personally and professionally, because sometimes the assumption is, at least professionally, that if you're always giving bad news, that you must just be a pessimist. You must just be focused on the negatives all the time. You don't report all the positive news. You don't report all the good global warming news that's out there. Or you never report when the weather is nice, which of course is not quite true, but no one really is particularly interested in that conversation because it's kind of boring. But the reason I raise that today is that, you know, being the bearer of bad news makes you rather unpopular in certain circles. And I've seen this both, as somebody who is a state employee in California, as somebody who works, has dabbled in the private sector and worked with different companies and organizations on weather and climate and natural hazard related problems. I'm very honest about the way I think things actually are, rather than the way I think people want to hear things. So, maybe that's being overly honest. But I think in this moment, I think there are two things that I have in my mind simultaneously. One is that I am seriously concerned about what comes next, not just in the United States, but also globally. Partly because the U.S. is, of course, an influential nation in the global geopolitical sphere, but also because some of the successes that we've had on the climate front, the Paris Accord or anything else, is largely based on a fairly tenuous consortium of sort of mutually agreed upon priors, in the sense that there is not necessarily the sum is definitely greater than the parts in this sense, and these global agreements are successful primarily because they are shared by many nations. And I think we know that now the United States is very likely to officially exit, for example, the Paris Agreement next year. And it's not so much that the United States is the be-all and end-all of global climate. If every other nation on Earth were going to address the problem on their own, that would also work. But I think the problem is the likelihood that that is the trajectory, rather than sort of a disillusion of some of the progress that had already occurred, is a real question. If the U.S. isn't going to be leading, it's not necessarily clear who will, and it might give other nations an excuse to back off of the accelerator as well. But the other challenge too, and frankly I think this is my greater short-term concern, is the very clearly stated ambition to disassemble the administrative state in the United States. That is a very clearly articulated aim, and this is what I was talking about, for example, a couple of weeks ago when I talked about NOAA and the National Weather Service and Project 2025. I talked about how the National Weather Service will probably still exist in some form regardless, but could very easily be greatly diminished to the point of not acting in the benefit of the public interest, despite historically being a world-class public service, taxpayer funded. That extends to so many other types of government agencies and entities and departments and divisions. And you can make the argument that we should completely ignore the stated public policy plan for what will now be the second administration of Donald Trump, with a Senate and a Supreme Court that are strongly ideologically aligned, and increasingly likely also the House of Representatives. So both chambers of Congress, the executive branch, and now also the Supreme Court. And when I work with people, this is sort of both a personal and a professional thing. If somebody tells me they're going to do something, well, I think anybody who's ever worked with other people or has family members or friends, one thing you look to is, okay, do they have a track record of doing what they say that what they're going to do? And also, in this particular context, whatever that context is, do they actually have the means to do so? Do they have a plan? And is their plan implementable? Is there a realistic way that they're actually going to achieve what they say they want to do? And that is why I'm concerned, because the answer here is, by all indications, yes. If you have both chambers of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the executive branch, and you have a very clearly articulated policy for ways in which you're going to dismantle the administrative state, you're going to leave the Paris Agreement, you're going to emphasize oil and the dramatic expansion of oil and gas production domestically and abroad, and move away from measures of environmental protection and pollution controls. It's one thing to be aspirational about it and say, if we win, we'll do this at some point. It's a very another thing then to say that you're still going to do that after actually having won and having a very clear blueprint for implementation. I'm, again, a strong believer in taking people's word largely at face value, especially if they give you an indication that you should. And I've heard from some folks who are on the Heritage Foundation mailing list this morning who sent out an email blast essentially emphasizing that they are already beginning preparations to follow through on Project 2025 and fully dismantle the administrative state in this country. And that's going to affect many thousands of public servants who have been doing their jobs for decades, dutifully and in the background, through many different presidential administrations, Republican and Democratic. And so this is not just another election, by all accounts. And I think there have been some insightful commentaries about that already. As you can probably tell, I'm a little bit struggling to articulate what I think the gravity of today actually is, because, of course, it's important for far more reasons than just weather and climate and science in general, or even disaster response. And this is something I didn't talk about in our limited time discussing Project 2025 before the election, but just as an example, it's quite possible that the Federal Emergency Management, FEMA, agency won't be able to function as a coordinator of disaster response or as a disseminator of disaster funds much past January. There's a stated goal to restructure and perhaps get rid of it. The National Flood Insurance Program, if you have federal flood insurance, it's unclear whether that program is long for this world. The policy documents also say that is likely to be dismantled. And keep in mind, you cannot currently buy private sector residential flood insurance in this country because the risk was viewed to be so high that insurance companies said we would always go bankrupt if we insured those structures. So without that subsidized federal program, it's unclear what would replace it, if anything. The same thing is rapidly approaching for the insurance market risks for wildfire, which is, of course, maybe the most relevant thing in California, although flood risk, as I've noted before, looms large, and for hurricanes, as well as other sorts of natural hazards. And so we're in this moment where a lot of things could change very quickly, and I'm not sure folks have quite absorbed just how many things could change. Everything from the ability to go to weather.gov and get a weather prediction, all those emergency alerts you've started getting on your smartphones, those may or may not continue. And again, yes, I am speculating, but I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb When somebody creates a multi-100-page policy document and says that if we win, this is exactly what we're going to do, and the reason we're writing it down now is so we have a plan to implement it starting on day one. And then with this electoral outcome, I don't really see any reason why that won't happen, because there will not really be any checks in Congress or potentially at the Supreme Court. And so yes, I'm talking about the politics of this moment, and it's very obvious, I think, to anybody who's listening how I feel about this personally and professionally. I wish it weren't so obvious. I wish this conversation were completely unnecessary or unwarranted or unreasonable, but I just don't think that it is at this point. And so one other reflection, though, which is that as somebody who is used to being the bearer of bad news in so many different contexts, and that's made me, I think, unpopular among potential employers as well as among people who have to hear that bad news frequently, among other entities. I think the other thing to realize is that talking about the big bad stuff is not an expression of fatalism at all, I think. I actually would argue it's quite the opposite, in the sense that it's important to be honest about what you're up against if you're going to effectively mount any kind of response to it that improves outcomes. Even if improving outcomes in a particular context means making things less bad than they otherwise would have been. This is a concept in public health known as harm reduction, and it really just stems from the notion that sometimes you can't prevent all of the harm, but you always want to prevent as much of it as possible, and sometimes there are ways to intervene knowing that the level of harm won't be zero, but that it would be unethical not to reduce it to the minimum possible level. And so that's just an example of borrowing some language from another space. The whole reason we talk about, when I've been talking about in our recent documentary that's available on YouTube about climate extremes and Earth system tipping points, which the likelihood of tipping them, I think, is now tangibly higher than it was earlier this week. And yet the reason we talk about this is not to impugn that the end of the world is nigh and that we should all give up, but it's quite the opposite. And I don't know anybody in climate science, in federal service, anywhere else, who finds this moment as a time to take the foot off the gas or to give up or throw up your hands. I don't see that being anybody's response in this space, and I don't think it should be yours either. So I raise all of this bad stuff and some pretty dark predictions about what might be coming, not to scare people, not to be a fearmonger, as is so many emails in my inbox today have suggested, but it's really to think about, okay, what is the purpose of, and I talk about this in the context of wildfire risk or flood risk or even earthquake risk, any sort of hazard, potential bad outcome. What is the point about gaming it out? Why do we have scenarios? Why do we have the shakeout scenario or the arc storm scenario? What is the purpose of going through that practical and mental exercise of asking the what ifs the big bad thing happens? The whole purpose is so that when it does, or even if it does in some cases, but in many cases it's a question of when rather than if, we're better prepared for it. We've created a more resilient society. We have better infrastructure to manage the hazards. We have a language to use in discussing this. And that is the spirit in which, I have this conversation with folks today, which is to say, as I've said before, as a human being, I have my own priors and beliefs, and I don't think it's any great mystery, even though I really do try to not to separate that from my professional life in every context where it's not appropriate. But I think there are some contexts where that reality is an important part of the conversation, and I think this is one of them. And in terms of what comes next, I'm not necessarily any better able to predict that than anyone else in terms of what we experience in 2025 and onward. But I do think that it's going to change the dynamic in terms of where the most constructive interventions to address climate change, to address disaster risk, to address any number of other societal things. But again, I'm trying to stay in my lane, at least to a limited extent, given the conversation at hand. We may see a shift from federal level support to needing to spin up programs locally and at the state level. And California does have a good track record of doing that when needed in the past. But there are efficiencies of scale that you can't get at that level, which is why I'm optimistic that we'll try, but it's going to be hard, and a lot of these may be an uphill battle. And so I think that there are going to be some pretty major challenges ahead, and I think it's difficult to discern exactly what that's going to look like. But my personal view is that we do have a sense of where things are headed based on just taking people literally at their word, and the things that there has been stated interest in achieving in the first 90 days of a second Trump presidency, I think have been very clearly articulated, and I think we should be planning as if the incoming administration will do exactly what it has said it wants to do in terms of dismantling a lot of federal agencies. I'll remind folks that on the climate change side of things, the president-elect has, as recently as this week, said that climate change is a hoax and that the world is getting colder. Those are just factually untrue statements. But the bigger concern is that in these policy documents, and this is not the case during the first Trump administration, which I think even folks who were part of the administration have argued was rather disorganized and chaotic and was not particularly focused on certain policy outcomes. That is not likely to be the case this time around, because there's a clearly articulated plan and a clearly articulated path to achieving it. Project 2025 and related documents specifically call out NOAA and climate science and climate scientists in general as being tools of the quote climate alarmism machine. So what does that mean for not just climate change research, which is important, but perhaps the least important thing on all of this list is research funding? But what does it mean if a policy priority is to remove all mention of climate change, all funding for climate change related activities, even activities of the National Weather Service that touch on climate even peripherally, which you could argue is almost everything in a world where all extreme weather events are unfolding in the context of a changed climate. I think it's difficult to predict exactly what that looks like, but I think we have a sense. So what I think I want to leave folks with is really two seemingly disparate messages, but that I actually think are both consistent with one another for the reasons that I mentioned. I think that when someone tells you that dark times are ahead, hopefully they're not just trying to scare you or to depress you or to coerce you into just sitting around and not doing anything about it. Hopefully the goal in so doing is to make the dark times less dark, to make bad outcomes less bad. And I think it's going to be a little bit clearer exactly how to do that once we get a better sense of how things are going to evolve in the months to come. So in January and February and March, I think it may be a little bit clearer what the most constructive path forward will be. But I do think we should expect to see large shifts pretty quickly and to be prepared for that in January and in February. And I know some folks may think that I'm being mysterious and vague on purpose, and I guess I am, because I think to try and make specific predictions about the order of operations and exactly what things are going to look like is probably a fool's errand at this point. And you're going to get a range of opinions too, from across the weather and climate world and the public policy world and the pundit world, as to exactly what the next few years are going to look like. And there certainly is room for reasonable disagreement there. I mean, I don't have any magic insights beyond having been pretty deeply enmeshed in this space and having read verbatim a lot of the proposed policy documents, and having some sense of the role of the administrative state and of various federal entities and agencies in improving the lives of Americans in this space. But the reason, and I think you can probably sense that I am still struggling to find the language to articulate this, partly because I would really rather not be having this conversation. Not just that I would rather have had the outcome be different to this particular election. I think that anyone who's listening, that's pretty clear on a personal level, but I don't like talking about politics. I engage with politicians. I brief members of Congress. I was at the White House last year. And I engage with their staff. In fact, that's actually a much more common interaction, because I think even in Congress, and this has been true, by the way, over the years, I've engaged with the office staff of Democrats and Republicans and independents, both within California and across the country, and having conversations about wildfire and extreme weather and climate. And there has been, in many cases, a lot of common interest in solving certain problems. But a lot of that was predicated on having some semblance of a common shared reality, even if that shared reality is we don't want people to die in floods, or we don't want massive economic harm to befall people that we could potentially have avoided if we had early warning systems in place, or we had invested in community infrastructure, or in insurance programs to prevent small businesses from going under during disasters. And a lot of what has currently been proposed as priorities for the first 90 days would be in direct opposition to all of that. The message really seems to be you're going to be on your own, rather than coming together to solve problems and trying to find common ground. So I hope that there's a change in course. I hope that's actually not what happens. I hope that I'm wrong. And that's something, a sentiment that I'm quite used to, by the way. Most climate scientists hope that they're wrong all the time. Meteorologists predicting a tornado outbreak hope that they're wrong. Who wants to see that unfold? But those meteorologists have that pit in their stomach type feeling leading up to these events, sometimes because they have a fairly good sense that they're not going to be wrong and that it could get quite bad. And, that's the feeling that I have today, and I'm probably not alone in that. Could be wrong. I hope that I'm wrong. But if I'm not, it's going to be a tumultuous period, I think, particularly in the space for folks who care about weather and climate and disasters, which arguably should be all of us everywhere in the world. But I realize that some people are more plugged into that than others until it's unavoidable. I know there were plenty of folks in Spain a few weeks ago, and North Carolina and Florida last month who were not particularly plugged into the climate change conversation, and then it came for them, whether they wanted to bear witness or not. They didn't have much of a choice, which is a tragedy. And I really hope that we don't see continued escalation in that, but my fear is that we're going to on this current path, and that there's no immediate off-ramp to it. I think that's the other challenge, is that we're likely going to be stuck with the fallout from this 2024 election for years. And we're going to have to learn how to operate in that space. And, my hope is that we can continue to have constructive conversations. If you're a frequent visitor to the Weather West blog, you may, and especially in the comments section there, you may be familiar with the fact that the comment section on the Weather West blog is an almost impossible place in the internet these days, in the sense that it is a comment section where each individual blog post, of which there are about, 20 per year or something like that, has thousands and sometimes even tens of thousands of comments. And occasionally there's some off-topic posts. There's definitely some posts of dogs and some photographs of power lines, and every once in a while there'll be an off-topic or political rant. And I try to delete those because, just based on history, it's difficult to maintain a coherent, welcoming, inclusive comment section if politics is the topic of the day. I am the sole moderator for hundreds of thousands of comments on top of my other jobs, and that just isn't tenable. But the cool thing about that comment section, is that there is less political agreement, I think, among the people who frequent that comment section than a lot of places on the internet. Your social media algorithm, and for better or for worse, perhaps many people watching this live stream right now, as I've seen the numbers creep up, is that in this era, various algorithms essentially reinforce your own pre-existing views on things. The algorithms work to enhance divisiveness by feeding you what you already want to hear. And I'm well aware of that in my engagement with the social media and media landscape, that, a lot of what I do is sometimes perhaps not reaching outside of the bubbles that I wish that it was. But there are some spaces, I think, where it does. And I think the Weather West comment section is an interesting microcosm of a community where it isn't perfect, but it works better than it should. It works better than it does almost anywhere else on the internet. And I'm always afraid to mention this publicly, because for fear of breaking the whatever the secret sauce actually is. But I hope that there are more venues for those kinds of conversations. I hope that here on YouTube can be that. I hope that we can find spaces to have conversations about what the most constructive path forward is, despite the challenges that are likely to grow. And that's not me saying that we should all agree with each other, or that we can agree to disagree. I actually don't think that's the case for many things. We really do have to have a common basis and some shared reality. We have to acknowledge that that the Earth is warming when it comes to climate. I would hope that we could mutually acknowledge that it is a good thing when people don't die in disasters or have their homes or livelihoods ruined. I would hope so. that's a fairly uncontroversial statement, even in the era we're moving into. It may or may not be for everybody, but I hope that enough people can agree on those sorts of things that we can at least have conversations about what to do next as things evolve. And I'm glad that I'm seeing most of the comments as they roll in here, and I think they've all been in that spirit as well today. So I appreciate that. So obviously, this is, I think, a difficult moment for a lot of people, but also there are a lot of people in this country who are thrilled with the electoral outcome. Obviously, I'm not one of them, but I think it's important to acknowledge that reality too. Is that this was an election that was pretty handily won by Donald Trump. It was not even that close in the end, and I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, because it means that in having these conversations, we need to be having them in the context of understanding that many millions of people in this country had their reasons for doing so, but actively made that choice. And so I'm not going to get into why I think that is. I think that there's a variety of reasons why that is, but the reason I raise that today is simply to say that we're going to have to learn how to have these conversations in an environment that's going to get even more divisive, even more toxic, be characterized by even greater echo chambers than we're used to, and arguably all of those things have already been a tremendous problem, and perhaps are a big part of the reason why we've gotten here today. The level of dissonance and active misinformation and hateful speech. Again, the amount of hate mail I've received today is an unprecedented level, and I haven't even checked my inbox in several hours. So I'm steeling myself for that, as are other scientists. But the reason I say this is we're going to have to figure out how to operate in this environment. And perhaps the Weather West comment section can be a bit of a lesson in how to do that. It's not perfect by any means, and no modality ever is going to be in this setting. But hopefully we can at least find a way to make it work on some level. And again, the only reason I talk about the potential or even the likely dark times ahead in this space and in other adjacent spaces is not to be a foreteller of inevitable doom and gloom and to dissuade people from engaging with their communities. It's quite the opposite. It really is in the spirit that scientists think about disaster preparedness and extreme events, which is to study them so that we can understand these sorts of outcomes and make the future better, even if that better future sometimes has to be a less bad future than some alternative trajectory. And I know that sounds like it might be an underwhelming goal, but sometimes that is you make the improvements that are achievable in a particular context, and hopefully we'll emerge from this at some point, and we will be able to take climate change more seriously, and we will be able to recognize the value in preventing preemptively harm that might otherwise befall people from any number of contexts, whether it's a hurricane or a pandemic or a war. All of these things intersect, by the way. They're not independent hazards. And I realize that I've been speaking long enough that my lighting has now changed dramatically. I need to turn on the overhead lighting or something So now I'm looking like I'm joining you from a shadowy cave somewhere. I guess it fits the vibe, perhaps. But I do appreciate that several hundred people have joined this live stream. And for my part, I have no plans to change doing what I'm doing. This is not going to become an overly political channel. I don't plan to talk about politics the vast majority of the time. This will remain an unusual situation. Most of the time, it's going to be weather, climate, and disasters. So, uplifting stuff, right? But I think it can be, and again, even as I said, all of that is in the spirit of education, because it can be interesting and fascinating, and there is a certain amount of wonderment with the world around us, but also because the practical goal of all of this is to make bad things less bad and create a better future in doing so. So I have no plans to change what I'm doing. I'll continue to be here. I'm on lots of social media platforms. I've hedged my bets. I know some folks have their concerns with X or the platform formerly known as Twitter. I am still there for now because I think it's important to continue to have a presence and not cede the space. It is definitely the source of the vast majority of hate mail and death threats that I receive, so that may or may not continue forever, but I am present elsewhere. I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Threads, Mastodon, here on YouTube, and I'm really liking the level and the type of engagements that I'm able to achieve on YouTube. I was reluctant to pivot to video, but maybe it's a good thing that I did it when I did, because it's turned out to be a very worthwhile pivot. I know folks appreciate it. I appreciate the interactions. I like being able to do these live streams. I'm going to continue to do research on weather and climate extremes and communicate with the public and in my public science role. I am fortunate that I am not a federal scientist that will necessarily be subject to the same whims. And I am fortunate, that I have institutions and individuals who have supported me, including the crowdsource support. It really is sometimes humbling, the amount of grassroots support that Weather West, the not so pseudonymous pseudonym, I guess that identifies me on the internet these days, has received over the years. So I appreciate that greatly, and I have no plans to change any of that. And so again, this is not going to become Politics West channel. Even as we may face some very politically tinged conversations in the months and years to come, I'll engage with them only as needed in furtherance of the broader goal of really understanding weather and climate, helping people work through the warming world that we're living in, and and individual disasters, as they unfold. I mean, even today in this conversation, there is a wildfire emergency unfolding in Southern California, as I discussed at the beginning. So we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Any number of aphorisms that I've used today, that's another one. But I think I'm just about ready to wrap it up, since I think my voice is giving out. I've spoken with a lot of people so far today. That's not new. Is this? I think the real lesson here is that we should all probably take a deep breath, because some things are probably going to get pretty challenging in the months and years to come. But also, that's not a reason to give up. It's very much the opposite. It's a reason to engage, to redouble our efforts, and to really find ways to bridge partisan divides when we can, even though I think that is actively going to get harder. And so it's going to take more active effort to do, and to find common ground for conversations where it's appropriate. That doesn't mean that it's fair to agree to disagree about everything. There are some things that I personally and professionally simply am not going to compromise on. We can't say that, well, the Earth is warming, but it's only warming at half the rate that it actually is. That just is what it is. I'm not willing to compromise on the notion that it's bad when people die and lose their homes and livelihoods in a disaster. I think that's something that is something that I'm not going to change my view on regardless. But I think that we can find those places of commonality and try and move forward where we can. So I may have some more specific suggestions in a few months, as I say, once it's a little bit clear where we're headed. Right now, I know it's all a bit vague and a little bit overwhelming. This is not my typical session. But I appreciate folks joining. This was partly me just rambling on for an hour. Probably isn't the first time I've done that, but in any case, I do appreciate the ongoing support. I'm going to continue to try and foster communities like this one where that is possible. And hopefully we can continue to build other ones in this space and others where it is possible to have those sorts of lively but human conversations where we can find some semblance of a shared reality and move forward from there. So, thanks for joining today. Take a deep breath. Step away from your inbox. Maybe turn off the TV for a while, and then, we'll move forward from there. All right, before the sun fully sets and I turn into a pasty white balloon, I'm gonna end the stream. So, with all of that, thanks, and talk to you next time.